And every time I went back to it, I realized that what I was struggling with was language itself and the limitations of language to convey this very kind of other landscape, this very otherworldly place that's a completely stupid place for humans to be. It's a dangerous place for humans to be. We don't belong there.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 144 of the Strokecast. Today's episode is brought to you by the fine folks at Modus Nova. To find out if Modus Nova can help you recover the use of an affected limb after stroke, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. And by the fine folks at Like Minded. To learn if this nonprofit membership community can help you live your best post-stroke life, visit strokecast.com/Like Minded. Most authors that I have on this show are, well, stroke survivors, writing about their experience, or writing fiction as part of their new lives, or in some cases, writing fiction from before their new lives, or even nonfiction from before their new lives. Regardless, they're generally stroke survivors, or they're industry professionals writing about stroke and recovery. Author John McGregor is none of those. He is a fiction writer and has written a bunch of books. But when a friend of a friend survived a stroke with aphasia, it made John himself confront his own fears. He managed to work through those fears as novelists often do, with research and with writing. John's latest novel, Lean, Fall, Stand, follows the story of a scientist in Antarctica who acquires aphasia following a stroke during a massive storm. This week, we talk with John about his novel, his research, and the issues involved in writing about a marginalized community when you are not quite part of that community. So now, let's meet John McGregor. So John, thanks so much for joining us on the show this week.
Thank you for having me.
We talk with a lot of authors on this show, but usually most of the authors we talk with are writing about their own personal stroke experience. They're writing a memoir, or they're talking about work they did before their stroke. In this case, we're talking about your new novel, which is stroke related, but, it takes a very different approach from a lot of the other authors we've had on the show. So can you tell us a little bit about the book?
It was supposed to be a novel about Antarctica, and that's where the book starts, with three men in Antarctica working there on a mapping project. They get caught up in a storm, and it's all very dramatic and tense and exciting. One of the men, the older man of the group, actually has a stroke during this storm and is airlifted back to Cambridge, where he's from in England, and back to a very, very different life to the one he's been used to. The book was supposed to be, as I say, all about Antarctica, and the kind of that drama of the storm was going to be the whole novel. And somewhere along the line, I got sidetracked, and I became much more interested in writing about stroke and about aphasia in particular. The bulk of the book is about this man Robert's recovery, his surviving the stroke. It's about his wife's journey of kind of acceptance and her role in his recovery. And it's about the two of them learning to live with his aphasia and learning to kind of understand what that means for them and for their life together.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because a lot of times we think about it's the dramatic things, the big major events, storms in Antarctica, that are where the real drama and conflict happens in people's lives. But really, it's in the really interesting stuff is in what many folks just think of as the mundane, the health challenges that people face as they just go through life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's always interested me as a writer, and I think as a reader as well, is in a way, anybody can make a car crash or a storm or a bank robbery sound exciting and kind of leap off the page. And actually what I find much more interesting is what happens afterwards, and what happens kind of in the immediate moments and the weeks and the months and the years that follow, and kind of what happens in kind of on the edge of the screen, out of the corner of your eye. I think those are the much more interesting parts of life.
And those are things that, when we're talking about writing and novels, the medium gives you the space to explore that you might not get in an hour-long TV drama in the same way, which has to focus more on the incident rather than just the nature of the life everybody goes on living afterwards.
Yeah, and that's what I love about writing novels, is it's such an expansive form, and it's such a kind of liberating form. In this novel, I was able to describe the kind of the drama and the tension of the storm and all the kind of the struggle that they're going through to survive. And then I was able to kind of, within the same page, kind of shift focus to what's happening inside Robert's mind as he's experiencing what he doesn't yet realize is a stroke, and the kind of the way his language breaks down. And within a couple of pages, I'm with his wife in Cambridge, being woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call to tell her that something terrible has happened. And the novel allows you to kind of really jump around between different people's consciousnesses and different experiences in a way that I think is fairly unique to the novel form.
Of course, we've been talking about this interpersonal drama is where the real exciting stuff is. But of course, Antarctica itself is amazing. It's something most of us only have a vague familiarity with, aside from being very cold and very icy and very isolated. But we can pretty much all agree penguins are awesome. But aside from that, I mean, what was it that interested you in setting a story that starts in Antarctica and your original plan of writing mainly about Antarctica?
To be honest, I kind of owed it many years ago, 17 years ago, in fact. I applied for a writing residency in Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey, the government organisation that do research in Antarctica. And they were advertising for a couple of places for artists and writers to go down and spend some time there. And obviously, you see an advert for something like that, you stick your name down in the kind of vague hope that it will come off, and it did come off, and off I went. It was an incredible experience. I felt incredibly fortunate to be there. It was a peculiar experience in that the trip didn't go at all to plan, and the ship I was on that was supposed to be taking me to the main research base where I was going to be living for several weeks, that ship never made it through the ice that season. The ice was too thick around the peninsula. We spent about 5 or 6 weeks on the ship trying to get to the base, and then gave up and came back to the Falklands. So the trip was, in a weird way, a disappointment, but obviously not in a way that I could really admit to anyone it was a disappointment, because I'd still gone to Antarctica. I'd been in the ice. I'd seen the penguins. I'd seen the amazing landscape. And I'd spent time with people who knew Antarctica and had worked there for many, many years, and I'd heard their stories. So I had this incredible experience, and essentially I'd gone there on the promise that I would write some fiction off the back of it. Then I came home and failed to do so, and I tried several times to start a book, to get a book going, and each time kind of ground to a halt and stopped and wrote another book instead. And every time I went back to it, I realized that what I was struggling with was language itself, and the limitations of language to convey this very kind of other landscape, this very otherworldly place that is Antarctica. And as you say, we all kind of have a sense of it. And when I got there, I was shocked by how much more it was than my expectation had been. It's huge, and it's cold, and it's alien, and it's completely inhospitable. It's a completely stupid place for humans to be. It's a dangerous place for humans to be. We don't belong there, and we're only there through kind of logistical ingenuity. And I found it very, very difficult to put that into words. And that was what first got me interested, in a strange kind of roundabout way, in aphasia. Was just doing a lot of thinking and a lot of reading about language and what happens when language fails. I was having difficulty with language in quite a superficial way, but somehow that got me interested in aphasia as a topic and as a theme for the book.
Well, I think that's a really interesting path into the idea of aphasia for those who haven't encountered the specific term. I mean, it's referring to the breakdown in the process between the thoughts we have and our ability to express them in some respects. And it also can go, in some cases, it goes the other way. The inability to interpret the things you read or things you hear into actual meaning. And I think that's an idea that is kind of alien to most folks who haven't encountered stroke world or brain injury world. But that idea of we've got this immense place of Antarctica that you can look around, you can see this, you can experience it, but you have these ideas and concepts of it, but your language center is failing to be able to articulate that.
Yeah, exactly. And what I found really interesting was, as I began to research stroke and read accounts and listen to accounts by stroke survivors, there's quite often there's a description that people have of the immediate aftermath of stroke. And some stroke survivors have talked about this kind of sense of peace and silence and being kind of in another place, and often kind of struggle to convey the immensity of that experience. And I'm not comparing my own experience of having gone to a cold continent with the experience of having a stroke, but that kind of that sense that you have an experience that you can't quite relate to the person you're trying to relate it to. I found a parallel there, and the kind of that extreme otherness of Antarctica as a place. For me, it kind of it kind of maps onto the otherness of the experience of stroke, which is incredibly alien to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any of these things that we can do, when we can start tying these experiences together, it's just, we're not saying it's just like this or it's just having this. It's more about these experiences give us a window into somebody else's experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think when you talk about that alienness, that out of timeness of the immediate math of post-stroke, I think a lot of folks, when we start looking at some of the other authors, Dr. Jill Bultese-Taylor, My Stroke of Insight, I mean,
yes.
Half of her book was about what is happening in that instant of a stroke, which is what a lot of people connect with first when they hear the story, because that initial drama. But then she spends half the book is about this experience of being out of time, this otherworldliness that can be a part of that experience.
Yeah, and hers was one of the accounts I was thinking of.
And I think one of the important things to know, too, is, of course, obviously every stroke is different, because my experience was nothing like that as I went through mine. So I think it's important for other survivors to always remember, just because you didn't have that experience doesn't make your experience any less legitimate. We all have because frankly, brains are weird. As you're going through this and going through this process over these 17 years of continuing to revisit this material that ultimately ends up starting in Antarctica, why did you choose to write Robert as someone experiencing stroke and then aphasia?
It was several things, and it's always difficult to kind of piece together the kind of thought process afterwards. But I know that one thing that really kind of stood out for me, still stands out for me, was hearing about another British novelist, a friend of a friend, really, who had a stroke soon after finishing, I think, his third or fourth novel. And, went to his own book launch almost entirely unable to speak and still has very, very limited language. And, that story to me was it was terrifying. As somebody who's made a career out of using language, as somebody who for whom language is the main way of kind of filtering the world, that story was terrifying to me and made me want to learn a lot more about a condition that I realized I knew very little about. And stroke is a really relatively common condition. It's a really prevalent condition, and I realized that I knew shamefully little about it. And so just kind of for my own sake, I was interested in learning more about it. And the more I learned about it, the more I kind of made those connections with the idea of language failing me as a writer. And And then the other thing that was going on was I was really interested in taking one of these characters in Antarctica who sees himself as very self-reliant, very capable, very kind of heroic, essentially, and taking all of that away from him. One of the things a fiction writer can be is a kind of I don't know, like a manipulative god, and so well if you think you're okay, I'm gonna tinker with your life and see how you cope with that. But I was really interested in one of the threads that I see in some people who have worked in Antarctica, and some of the writing about Antarctica can be quite kind of in quite a male way, very, very kind of hung up on ideas of self-reliance and this kind of heroic strength, I guess. And I was really interested in taking one of those characters and flipping that on its head and seeing what would happen. And so, yeah, I just, in this kind of godlike, writerly way, I just zapped this guy with a stroke to see what would happen. And what happened was the book changed gear completely and became about hospitals and about therapy and about care, and the burden of care and all of those things that the book turns into.
That's very interesting for a number of respects. For one thing, when you talk about being this, as the author being sort of this god crafting things in this universe and then zapping him with the stroke. I mean, if we look at where the term stroke comes from, it goes back couple centuries to the idea of when people who suddenly lost their function, it was like they were struck down by God. And, that term persists, so, and it just seems like one that just fits in a very natural way.
Wow.
From that.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. That's, yeah.
What I also think is interesting is that one of the things I've typically heard, the short guidance for writing fiction is find your characters, find what they want, and then find a way to interfere with them getting what they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when you start talking about interrupting their self-reliance, that falls into it.
Yeah, I mean, on that basis, once he's back home in Cambridge and his wife is kind of getting used to their new life together, what they both want is to fix it. And especially Robert, he's gone through his life being able to fix things and kind of use his intellect and his mechanical skills to fix broken things. And so what he expects from therapy in particular is to fix his language. And that doesn't happen. And that's, what the book becomes about is how he very, very slowly gets used to the idea that this is not simply going to be fixed. That he has to do something other than fixing it.
Well, I think one of the things that comes out as he's living with his aphasia and not uncommon, you get 2 or 3 words back and just use them for everything. It seems like the most common word coming out of Robert's mouth is obviously. Yeah,
and that's that was a common word that he used before his stroke in quite a kind of a typical man of that generation, kind of constantly explaining things and making things sound obvious. So that was the kind of a tick that kind of carries over to his communication with aphasia.
One of the other things that we also hear about writing a lot is that the guidance is, basically write what you know. And in this case, what you're doing, it sounds like a lot of this was inspired by writing about what you fear, the idea of that loss of language. And writing provides an author an opportunity to explore their fears in the way that other folks may, watch horror movies and things like that.
Yeah, I think that fear was a kind of an initiating energy. But I think quite quickly I became much more interested than fearful, and I became much more intrigued by the process of speech and language therapy, by the process of people with aphasia developing communication strategies, developing ways of living with their aphasia, of the impact on the families around them. But I was constantly aware that I was not writing what I know. I was writing a long way beyond my own knowledge. And what became really important for me was to acknowledge that, really, and to make sure that I was gaining as much knowledge as possible, so that I wasn't kind of, taking a kind of, creative literary advantage of a situation that I had insufficient understanding of.
From realizing, hey, this is something I want to learn more about after, seeing your friend of a friend go through that, and thinking about how this could impact Robert in the book. I mean, how did you go about learning then about stroke and aphasia in particular?
I kind of went through a process. I kind of circled around the problem of my own lack of understanding. So I started with reading memoirs and reading medical textbooks and lots of kind of speech and language therapy books. I listened to podcasts, including your own podcast. I read blogs. I watched series of YouTube videos that lots of stroke survivors, people with aphasia, have made fantastic series of videos on YouTube, which were fantastic to watch and really helpful. And eventually I kind of got over my own kind of natural cowardice and made contact with speech and language therapists locally here in Nottingham, who were incredibly generous with their time and kind of patiently talked me through some of the kind of the details and nuances of all the different forms that aphasia can take, and the process of assessment and the process of therapy. And then I was able to spend some time on the stroke ward in the local hospital with a speech and language therapist as she was doing the initial assessments with people who very, very recently had strokes, which again was incredibly generous of her and of the stroke survivors and their families themselves, who allowed me to sit in on those assessments. And from there, I then eventually joined a local aphasia self-help group. And for about a year, I think, until the lockdown hit, I was going to this group that was meeting monthly in a local community centre and taking full part in their meetings, which was great. And I'd kind of got along thinking I would kind of hide in the corner and observe, and they made me sit at the table with them and take a full part in the sessions, and take part in the quizzes and the singing and everything. And what was fantastic about that was learning for myself kind of in real time what I'd understood in theory, which was, as you said earlier, every stroke is different, every brain is different, every iteration of aphasia is different, and all of these generalizations I've been reading about didn't apply to anyone in particular. And I met people and I developed friendships with people that I wasn't necessarily able to have substantial communication, verbal communication with. We were still communicating with gesture and facial expression and eye contact and drawing pictures on paper. And I found that process of kind of a non-verbal communication really powerful and really moving. And actually, once I thought about it, not that surprising, because there is so much more to our communication with each other than simply language, that I shouldn't have been surprised that I was able to develop connections with people without full language.
Ultimately, I think a lot of the growth in social media we've seen over the last 15 years is because everybody wants to be heard, everybody wants to be acknowledged, everybody wants to be able to tell their story. And when somebody is willing to spend the time and to learn to communicate with somebody who's living with aphasia, and with that patience and acceptance, it really opens up for people who have been limited in how they can share their story for some time.
I kind of scratched the surface with this group. I went for a year, but actually that's a relatively short time frame. And I could see how the people in this group had been helping each other over several years to develop different strategies for communication, more patience, more confidence. Yeah, I could see the way that their relationships had developed and emerged. And yeah, it was really interesting. It was really valuable, and I was really open with them. From the outset, I'm here to do research for a novel that I'm writing. I'm interested in you and your lives, and I'm interested in how you live with aphasia. And they were really respectful of that and kind of appreciative of that in a way that I hadn't been expecting. I think because they had a feeling, and I've heard this elsewhere, that aphasia is not something that is widely understood or talked about or even represented in popular culture. So I think they were interested to see what I came up with. But the thing that kind of bothered me throughout was that some of the people in that group, no matter how interested they were in what I was doing, were not going to be able to read the book that I wrote. And that was a real sadness.
That is unimaginable until you actually encounter it from folks, especially as a writer. Being able to read and consume is, I'm guessing that's likely just a core part of what you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I'm sitting here now, there's stacks of books surrounding me practically. And yeah.
And I think that's one of those things that's so important then, is in telling stories and in letting people read stories. And I'm flattered that this show was able to help in your research in some part, because one of my primary goals was just to help different people in different parts of the field to tell their stories and to break down some of those silos, to share some of those experiences.
It was great, kind of. There was yours. My mind has now gone blank, but there were 2 or 3 other podcasts that I listened to lots of episodes of, and what that did was really help me to kind of embed this idea of the diversity of experiences and the kind of multiplicity of experiences, which was incredibly valuable. Again, that's what I'm interested in as a reader of fiction, and certainly as a writer of fiction, is when characters and situations are specific and not generalized. I wanted to find a particular person with a particular experience of stroke and aphasia, not just some kind of generalized version of that.
So I think we've been talking a lot about the just trying to be sensitive to the stories of folks with aphasia and folks who are living with this life as having survived stroke. I mean, from a general perspective, whenever you're writing a main character that is part of a marginalized group that you are not a part of, obviously that is a lot of work to get it right. So, I mean, beyond your initial research and meeting with the group, what sort of steps did you take to try and ensure the authenticity of Robert's reactions and Robert's experiences, while at the same time making it uniquely about Robert?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's a really important question. And I think there's a long history of people who look like me, who are white and male and straight and able-bodied, writing about the experience of somebody in a different situation and doing so in a kind of slightly arrogant, problematic way, and getting it wrong. And I was really conscious of that while writing this. And I think what any writer owes the story is to use their imagination with knowledge and with understanding. And the further from their own situation that the story they're writing about is, the more knowledge and understanding they need to develop. And so the research was really important, and meeting people was really important, and showing people the draft of what I'd written afterwards was vitally important. And that's been the case in the past, and it was the case this time, was that actually the most important stage of the research is when you think you've got it right, you show it to somebody who knows more than you do, and they tell you what you've got wrong. My third novel was about a group of people struggling with drug addiction and living on the streets. And again, that's well outside my own experience, and I was having to kind of lean on other people's stories and borrow other people's stories to write that novel. And it was only once I'd given a draft to someone I knew who'd kind of gone through heroin addiction, come out the other side, and he corrected a few details, but he said, essentially you've got this. That was the most important review I had for that novel, much more so than reviews that were published later on, because I think if you're writing about an experience that is significantly far from your own experience, it's really important that you can trust that people who have lived that experience will recognize what you've written and identify with what you've written. And I hope that that's what I've done this time. And, it has been read by people with a lot more knowledge and understanding than me. And they corrected a lot and I changed a lot, but so far it seems to be working. But it's a tough thing, because I think writers of fiction can write beyond their own experiences, and to an extent should write beyond their own experiences, but there are all sorts of issues of power and prejudice and ownership and authenticity and appropriation that need to be thought about really, really carefully along the way.
So as you were going through this review process with the folks who were more deeper a part of this culture, I mean, what are some of the things that stand out to you that you learned or changed as a result of this process?
On the whole, they were fairly kind of technical bits and pieces to do with the process of therapy, the speech and language therapy in particular, the different stages that Robert was going through, even things as basic as, the third section of the book mostly takes place within this kind of group therapy setting. When I initially wrote the book, there was one therapist working with the group. And, I was told by a number of people, well, there would have to be two therapists in the room just for basic kind of health and safety. Something as basic as that, I hadn't thought through, and they were talking, they were saying, well, who's done the risk assessments and how, if this person has limited mobility, they're not going to be able to do X, Y, or Z. And so there were all of these kind of fairly basic technical issues that I was getting wrong that would immediately, for somebody reading that who knew that those things were wrong, that would immediately trip them up and make them think, okay, I'm not going to finish this book. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
It would take them out of the story.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really important to get those kind of simple details right, because in a way, I think I'm a writer of fiction. I make up characters who have relationships with each other and have thoughts and feelings about the situations they're going through, and in a way, the relationship between Robert, who's had a stroke and is kind of coming through the survival and recovery process, and Anna, who's his wife, who's thrown into being a carer for him and has all sorts of kind of mixed feelings about his dependency on her. I can imagine how they think and feel about their life. It's my job to kind of work out the subtleties and the nuances of that. But in order for that story to kind of to carry, I have to get the kind of the practical logistical details right. Those were the details that people helped me with, much more than the kind of emotional nuances.
I mean, as you're going through all this, obviously writing a book is a huge investment of your own time, your own mental energy, your own emotional energy, and you're learning about all of this. What would you say you've learned about yourself as part of the process of producing this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things I learned, which surprised me, was not so much about the writing process, but when I was going to the Aphasia Nottingham group and spending time with people with aphasia, and I was surprised by by the ways in which I was able to form connections with people, and I was surprised by how much those connections felt like friendships. And these were people who were mostly quite a lot older than me, and have had very different experience in life. And the way that I was included in that group and the way that I was able to communicate, often without language, was really surprising to me. I'm not naturally an outgoing person. I'm not naturally somebody who makes new connections and friendships. That surprised me. Something I also learned about myself while I was writing this book, and it was kind of almost in parallel, was I lost most of the hearing in one ear a few years ago. I had a very bad ear infection, and my eardrum was perforated and never grew back, and I had to start using a hearing aid. And there was a moment when the doctor had referred me to a specialist in the hospital, and I'd gone into the hospital expecting them to tell me how they were going to fix it. And they didn't. They said, "Oh, we can't fix this. We're going to get you a hearing aid, and that's probably going to make up for it." And it was the first time in my life, and I'm in my early mid-40s, it was the first time in my life that something had gone wrong with my body that was not going to be fixed. And it was quite a shock, which again, that is a mark of my privilege. That was the first time that had happened, and that, relatively speaking, it's quite a minor thing, but it was a real shock. And it was the first time I kind of became aware of the temporary nature of my own health and well-being, and it was a glimpse into the much more significant experiences that so many people have when their bodies stop doing what they were used to their bodies doing. And I'm sure that I applied, again, it's a kind of tiny echo, a tiny glimpse, but I'm sure that I applied that to the writing of the book.
I guess let's switch to some easier things now. Okay. You mentioned this all started because you got this writing residency in Antarctica. Folks in the arts field know instantly what that means, but those of us not directly in the arts field, we may have heard of residencies, but what exactly is a residency? What does that mean? What do you do? What do you have to do? How does that even work?
Well, do you know what? I at the time I applied for that residency, I had no idea, and I'm not sure I have much more idea now. But in that instance, this was a scheme that the British Antarctic Survey had set up, where each year they took two people, writers, artists, musicians, to Antarctica to have an experience of that place and of the work that the British Antarctic Survey do, and to then represent that experience in some way in their particular art form. And essentially it's a type of PR for the organization, and it's a government funded body who carry out science and research in Antarctica. And it was felt that having an arts element to what they did was important. And and arts has always been a part of Antarctic exploration. The very earliest explorers came back and wrote about it. Frank Hurley went and took those very early photographs, and was sketches and paintings, and that kind of artistic representation of the place has always been a part of the process. And so that was why they were very keen to have that program up and running. Lots of other institutions have residencies. Sometimes they're called retreats, sometimes they're called fellowships, and they vary a lot. And I guess sometimes it's simply providing space for you to go and write without much expectation of a kind of outcome. And sometimes it's a kind of glorified kind of PR exercise where they want you to write something very particular with a particular purpose and function. it was a strange thing. And I kind of applied for it on a whim, assuming I wouldn't get it, and got it, and kind of went there without really thinking it through. It's just like, yeah, I can go to Antarctica. I'll definitely write a book about it. Yeah, can I go? Can I go? Yeah, okay, I'm going to write a book. And got back and just thought, whoa, that was strange. I don't know if I can write a book about that, which is why it took as long as it did. But hopefully they think they've got their money's worth in the long run.
Right. Absolutely. And are residencies typically something then an artist does not pay for, or they might receive a stipend, or they might just receive space and access, or an artist shouldn't be paying for a residency, or it just varies.
I mean, again, there's a huge range. Yeah, I mean, ideally, it's not something you would be paying for. It's a kind of an organization or an arts organization or some kind of trust or fund has provided, has decided to provide time for writing or space for writing or maybe even a stipend, or sometimes a commercial organization will set up some kind of writing residency where you kind of maybe you do writing workshops with the staff or various kind of outcomes, and sometimes other organizations, there is you can pay to go somewhere to write for a month, and it's a kind of, you're paying for that time and space, and that can be valuable. But I did one or two of those at that point, and then I had children, and suddenly the ability to kind of disappear for weeks and months at a time became completely alien to my lifestyle. So it's been a long time since I've done anything like that.
As you're bringing books to market, and of course, as an established novelist, this of course very much informs your decision. But I mean, these days we have so many different ways of bringing a book to market, whether that's going to be, the traditional publishing model or the hybrid model or the self-publishing model to print on demand, to all these different ways to bring your story public. So, I mean, as a novelist with a track record, I mean, how did you choose to bring this particular novel to market, and why did you choose that path?
I guess it goes back a long way to when I first started writing, and when I first had stories and a novel to dare to think about sharing with the world, some people. And at that time, we're talking, I guess 1998 was the first time I sent any work out. I'd only had an email address for a year or two. There were maybe 5 websites that I'd been on. Wasn't quite a pre-internet age, but it was certainly pre-internet being the default. And so when I sent work out, I was putting it in a padded envelope and writing the address on and sending it to an agent or a publisher. And there didn't seem to be very much alternative. There was a kind of underground zine culture, and I'd done some writings for zines, but that seemed very kind of separate and very kind of other. And I was excited about writing stories, and I wanted people I didn't know to read them. That to me, that's what writing and publishing is making a connection with somebody you haven't met and you're not going to meet. That's the exciting thing for me. And so that's what the traditional publishing model at that time was essentially the only publishing model. And so that was what I took a stab at, and it worked out. It paid off, which was tremendously exciting and still is tremendously exciting. So by the time I was writing this novel, I was very much in traditional publishing land. I had a contract, I had editors waiting to read it, and a fantastic team of people at Catapult in the US and Fourth Estate in the UK ready to turn my manuscript into a book and to do all of the work that goes into getting a book into the world, which you can do some of that work, a lot of that work yourself, but it's a lot of different skill sets, and it's a lot for one person to kind of take on all of those themselves. But having said that, it's a really exciting time for writing and for publishing. And I teach writing at the University of Nottingham. And one of the things I'm constantly saying to my students is, you don't have to wait for a publisher to accept your manuscript. You've got tons of opportunities to get your work out into the world. You can publish your stories on literary websites. You can do a podcast. You can, I teach a class where we use Twitter as a platform for writing fiction, or doing stories on Instagram. And it's really exciting to see students kind of realize that what they're really familiar with doing, really comfortable doing, kind of putting text into the world, can actually be part of their writing, and kind of integrating their familiarity with the internet with their kind of writing of fiction and poetry, and getting their work seen. And I think increasingly, rather than writers having to kind of send their work to an agent and hope that it gets through, increasingly it's more a case of putting your work out in the world online, and that building its own audience, and then agents coming looking for you. I think it's a great time to be a writer. I think the text hasn't been valued as much for a long time.
I think that's really interesting when you start talking about with social media, with Twitter, and with blogs, and with all these other sources. I mean, I'm starting work on my own memoir about my experience. And one of the things that's been most valuable for me is just going back to the Facebook posts I was making from the hospital in 2017 as a contemporary record of what I was talking about. And if not my inner fears, what I was willing to share publicly with my network, and be able to go back in time and grab that, and to be able to pull that forward and figure out, okay, now what can I do with this? It's this piece that is easier to capture now that I have this record of what was happening then, unfiltered by the vagaries of memory.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many people are comfortable and confident doing that writing and putting that writing out into the world, even in, as with yourself, in that kind of situation, in that kind of intense situation, people are comfortable publishing their own writing. And it sometimes it kind of makes me smile when a student set them an assignment and they say, well, I don't know what to write. I don't do very much writing. And then you start talking to them about their social media, and they do lots of writing. They've somehow compartmentalized the two things. And I think breaking down that compartmentalization can be really fruitful.
And I think when we start circling back to stroke, a lot of times, a lot of what we're doing in recovery is we're trying to break down some of that compartmentalization about how we used to accomplish tasks. And as you go through therapy, and as you go towards living life and adapting to life with hemiparesis or aphasia or whatever it is, you've got to then go ahead and figure out, okay, let me pull this other thing from my life, use it in maybe a different way, but I can use this now to get to my new goal of what I want to accomplish. So it's about looking at that wider landscape of what I can do and what I have done in the past to be able to do things in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things. That's one of the things I learned. So it's the most important thing I learned while I was writing this novel was that kind of move away from fixing the thing that doesn't now work to finding new ways of doing things. And it's that's the journey that Robert goes on. Is that he learns new ways to do, not even necessarily the same thing, but new ways of doing things that work for him and for his relationships with people around him.
When you have to boil it down to, if you had to give one piece of advice, or 1 to 3 pieces of advice to new writers or to people who are thinking about writing fiction, what do you tell them?
I always tell people to read more. I think it's really, especially with my students and with people who are relatively new to writing, it's interesting to me that quite often they're not necessarily reading that much, and the best way of learning to write is by learning to read and learning to read the way that a writer reads. By kind of looking under the bonnet, essentially, working out what a writer has done to make that story or that poem or that piece of text work in the way that it's working. So definitely reading more. Then I tell people to write more. It's pretty straightforward, because another issue that newer writers sometimes have is this kind of fear of the blank page, and this kind of idea that we get from the movies, that the way you write is you sit at a typewriter with a blank piece of paper and a bottle of whiskey and wait for inspiration to strike you. And actually 99% of writing is in the rewriting and the redrafting. So you just have to write first and write regularly and write in a way that kind of becomes a habit, so that kind of muscle gets developed. You've then got the text that you can reshape and reform. Yeah, that's 2 for you. That's read more and write more. And that's probably enough.
Absolutely. I often tell folks when they get stuck, try specifically to write badly, because once you start trying to write badly, you give yourself permission to turn off your inner critic and just get stuff out there. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with when we talked a few months ago with Megan Larson, PT, about high intensity gait training. We don't need people to walk well in their recovery. We just need them to start walking. Just get going, get it done, and then we can work on refining it later on. But if you don't just start, you're never going to start. And that brings us to our hack of the week. But first, let's talk about Modus Nova. The Modus Hand is a robotic, air-powered, AI-controlled exoskeleton that can help stroke survivors get back an affected hand, or with the Modus Foot, an affected foot. Put it on, and it's like having a therapist in your home. The Modus devices help you move your hand or your foot as you play video games. The sensors within the device continually adjust to your skill level to provide assistance when you need help and resistance as you get stronger. It helps you get in the repetitions that you need to work through your recovery. And as we all know, repetition is key to engaging neuroplasticity. Visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova to find out if Modus Nova is right for you. Use promo code STROKECAST to save 10% off your first month. And now back to our hack of the week.
The 2 things I noticed that people in the group who I met were doing that was really valuable was, one, that several of them were really good at using their phones or their iPads to facilitate conversation. So I remember one particular conversation I had with a guy. He was just trying to tell me that he'd gone to Bristol to visit his niece or something like that. But he achieved that by getting out his phone, opening the map, and pointing. And we got into a long conversation about how he got to Bristol from Nottingham. We talk about which roads to take, and he was just, it was all pointing on the map. And other people would, whip their phones out and open photographs or open particular web pages. It struck me how valuable that was, and what a recent development that must be for a lot of people. And the other thing was, which again is really basic, and I'm sure most of your listeners will know this already, but just that simple thing of having the card that says, I have aphasia, I have difficulty understanding or expressing, just kind of basic outline of what aphasia is, because so few people have that knowledge of what it is. And I was really struck as soon as I started doing the research into aphasia, as soon as I started meeting people, I kept coming across situations in my everyday life where I would notice somebody getting onto the bus or at the counter in the supermarket, or wherever it was, who was having some difficulty communicating, and I could tell that they had aphasia. And it struck me that, okay, I've been seeing these people all my life, and they've been invisible to me because I haven't known about aphasia, and that really struck me. So the card, having the card that you can show people, seems to me to be a really useful tool.
It's amazing how once you have the language to describe aphasia, suddenly it's something your brain can observe around you.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, having the language, it's like if you're a bird watcher, once you know the names of the birds, suddenly you realize how many different birds are in the world. Where you're not listening to bird song, you're listening to particular birds singing. And yeah, having the language to give to something, to describe something, makes it more apparent in the world, which, conversely is one of the struggles that some people have with aphasia.
So John, this has been great. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
Probably my social media. I'm John_McGregor on both Twitter and Instagram. And there's no H in John. I can hear if people say John with an H in. So it's John_McGregor. And I talk about my writing and my reading and often about football as well on Twitter and Instagram.
Fantastic. And we'll have all of those links over in the show notes, along with links to the latest book and your previous novels as well. So folks can absolutely check that out. So John, thank you so much for joining us here today and evening your time. And this has been great. And thank you for continuing to spread the word about the lack of words many of our folks struggle with to the broader world.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time.
Now let's take a moment and talk about sponsor Like Minded. Like Minded is a nonprofit membership program featuring sessions and classes from some of my favorite people, many of whom have actually been guests on this show in the past. Online classes are scheduled throughout the week, and if you need more flexibility, members actually get access to recorded sessions. These sessions are led by OTs, PTs, speech therapists, doctors, psychologists, and, of course, stroke survivors. Members can attend as many sessions as they want and even get access to a private text messaging group for more personal support. So get the support that you need and deserve by joining Like Minded today. Visit strokecast.com/likeminded to learn more. And use promo code STROKECAST to save 20% off your first month. Now, when I first heard about John's book, I was kind of skeptical. I was concerned, really, about how appropriate it was for someone who hasn't been through this experience to not only write about it, but to create the very character that's going through it. I mean, it is a real trauma that people live through. And is it right for an outsider to simulate that trauma in a simulated individual, a fictional character? As I think about it, and part of the reason I have some concern is that it's a question I wrestle with myself. It's not just about John's choice here. It's about mine too. While I have survived a stroke, I haven't had aphasia. And I've spoken with and listened to lots of folks who have gone through that experience and recovered in various degrees. But it's still not my experience. And I find it equal parts utterly fascinating and utterly terrifying, especially as someone who makes his living by speaking, writing, teaching, and community. I mean, this getting on a mic and talking, or getting in front of a group of people and talking, or sitting down with a keyboard or a pen and paper and writing, I mean, this is my life. Aphasia, like any disability though, I mean, it isn't just an object of interest or fear. It is life for millions of people around the world. People just like you and me. And I mean, I know for some of them, the idea of losing the use of an arm or leg is as terrifying an idea for them as the idea of losing language is to me. Whereas I can look at, loss of use of an arm or a leg at this point and be like, well, yeah, that's super annoying. But it doesn't cause me to question my core identity and who I am. So when I do talk about aphasia, I mean, I try my best to be true to the lives of the people who live with it and not for lack of a better word, fetishize it. And to just try to recognize that this is just the normal everyday reality for so many people. So, what does that mean for writers? Well, it's complicated. I mean, on the one hand, the job of a creative writer is to write about people other than themselves, unless we want all our books to feature only characters whose ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, religion, economic background, etc. all match that of an author. At the same time, it's the responsibility of the author to present characters with different backgrounds and experiences accurately, honestly, and individually. And that hasn't always happened. We've been hearing more and more discussion about that in recent years. And we've heard more and more about the rise of sensitivity readers. These are members of the writer's editorial team whose backgrounds do reflect characters that are unlike the author. Their job is to call the author's attention to things they might have overlooked by virtue of just having a different background. Similar to the way the speech therapists who reviewed John's book were able to identify mistakes in how a therapy session would be run. Now, John's team sent me a copy of his book, Lean Fall Stand, and I've been reading parts of it. I'm looking forward to actually sitting back and reading it cover to cover with a nice cup of coffee or a nice glass of whiskey, depending on the time of day. But what I've read so far seems to present aphasia accurately, based on my secondhand experience, and the challenges of adjusting to life after stroke. So I'd encourage you to check it out and let me know your thoughts. Now, as part of the process of being able to do this, John did do, of course, a bunch of research, as we talked about in the discussion. He mentioned that he listened to a number of podcasts. Two of the shows he listened to, aside from this one, are Aphasia Access Conversations, which has a tremendous back catalog of stuff about aphasia and is a really interesting show to listen to, especially from a medical and researcher background. And he also listened to Stroke Stories, which is a show out of the UK that features individual stories of different stroke survivors. I was actually on that show a couple of years ago. And that's a little bit of a different show for highlighting the stories. It's not done in a traditional interview conversation format. It's more that they interview the survivor and then they edit their story together with a separate voiceover to provide those transitions. So it's an interesting approach to doing a podcast. And I encourage you to check that out as well. I'll include links to all of that, of course, over in the show notes at strokecast.com/Antarctica. Other resources that John drew from include Sarah Scott's YouTube channel, where she basically chronicles her experience of recovering from her stroke. I want to say her stroke was at roughly age 19, give or take a couple of years. And as you listen and watch the different videos she's made over the last 10 to 12 years, the recovery is quite striking. So definitely go ahead and check that out on YouTube. John also mentioned the theater piece Stroke Odysseys, and he's also learned from The Possibilities Are Endless, a movie which chronicles the story of musician and lyricist Edwyn Collins. And of course, all of those links are going to be in the show notes at strokecast.com/Antarctica. If you're looking for more stroke-related podcasts to listen to, be sure to check out strokecast.com/stroke-related podcasts. That has links to a list of about 13 or 14 other shows that deal with stroke. One additional note for creators that are out there today is that I am wrapping up this episode right after the issues that Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp had on October 4th. The sites were down for more than 6 hours, and I think we all either recalled that sudden burst of productivity we had or that sudden revival of our dormant Twitter accounts. If you create content Like maybe you run an Instagram page, or maybe you run your own YouTube channel where you chronicle your story and share with others. Maybe it's an active Facebook page or Facebook group. Those are great tools for building your community. But I'd encourage you not to build your entire presence on a single platform. And I think because, as we saw at the beginning of October here in 2021, those platforms can go away in an instant. And that could be because of technical reasons. It could be because there's a sudden change in terms of service that you might not agree with, or because some nefarious person targets your platform or your ID and gets you kicked off. So I would strongly encourage you to control your content on your own platform rather than relying solely on someone else's platform. That's why when folks want one place to go to learn more about me and learn more about this show, I point them to strokecast.com. I point them to my website, because from there, you can get to my Instagram where I put out a ton of stuff, Twitter, etc. But if those other platforms remove me for some reason, I still have the website. And ultimately, if the website goes down or my host crashes, I can move the site to another host because I own my domain. If Libsyn, my audio host for this podcast, suddenly disappeared, and that's not likely to happen, I still have copies of all these episodes backed up, both locally and in the cloud. I mean, is this going to be a foolproof system? No, absolutely not. But it does give me a lot more protection than relying on just a single platform. If you rely on just a single platform to share your story with the world, give some thought to how you might recover if that platform goes away for you. Now, we talked about the research that John did and the creators and storytellers he listened to as part of his research, and now about what creators need to think about in terms of most of their more platforms. But what's really important to think about from time to time is that when you are creating your content or you are sharing your story, you never know who you might be helping, educating, or influencing. And you don't know what they are going to be able to do with that. I mean, maybe it'll give someone the confidence to tell their story for the first time, or to accomplish something new at home or at work, or maybe even to go ahead and write a novel. So share your story in the best way that you are able. It's a great way to give back to the world, to contribute to the community, to help others, and to potentially inspire someone in their own creative endeavors. So check out John's book at Amazon, and you can find that over at strokecast.com/leanfallstand, and connect with John through Instagram and Twitter. You'll find all of those links over at strokecast.com/Antarctica. Share this episode with the author or book fan in your life by giving them the link strokecast.com/Antarctica. Be sure to subscribe to the Strokecast email newsletter at strokecast.com/news. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.